turned it on.
It should be doing it.
Which of these people would you feel more comfortable with in sharing the gospel with them? Are there some you might be a little hesitant? Are there barriers you put up in your mind that would maybe stop you from approaching one or a couple of them? You know, I love hearing stories about, we call them unlikely converts, people who come from atheism or people who come from maybe a very hard past, maybe they were in prison, maybe they came from gay, from giving these quote unquote unlikely converts. I love hearing their stories, but I do have to wonder, the fact that we like to weigh the odds in our mind and come up with who's more likely versus who's unlikely, I do wonder if we are, in doing that, taking certain assumptions that we shouldn't. And also I wonder if we're putting up barriers in the way. Because let's face it, throughout church history, there has been a lot of barriers that some within the brotherhood or outside the brotherhood have tried to put up, barring certain groups from entry. Or they put up barriers within a church so that, yeah, I'm your brother or sister, but I don't want to share a meal with them. You know, we separate out, and there's all kinds of barriers for our church history that have been put up. Gandhi told the story in his autobiography. When he was young and in law school in South Africa, he was very enamored by the character of Jesus. And he started reading the Bible. He loved the Sermon on the Mount. And if the stories he tells are to be believed, some question them. But I'm going to tell the story because even if it didn't happen then, I know this very same story has happened to many people throughout history. Gandhi says when he was in South Africa, he nearly became a Christian. He was so enamored with what he was reading that he decided to visit a church. But it was during apartheid in South Africa, the segregation. And he was met at the door by an elder who said, "You're not allowed in."
Yes, streaming.
Because of the color of his skin. In fact, he was threatened. The elder said, "I will get security, and I will have them throw you down these steps if you don't leave." Throughout church history, there have been barriers. But this morning, I want to focus on the first barrier, and we actually read about it in the book of Acts, chapter 10. We're not going to be looking at all of these chapters that are on the screen, but I just want to put on there because if you want to be studying this, I encourage you. Acts chapter 10, and then in chapter 11, and we're going to see it also in Galatians chapter 2 and 3. But this first barrier in the church that was barring certain people from entry was the barrier between Jew and Gentile. Okay? The first barrier. Let's go ahead and look at the story in Acts chapter 10 of a very unlikely convert. I do mean that. It really was. Now this story takes place in the midst of a section of Acts. Is this on? Yeah.
Hmm?
Alright, is that better? Alright, cool. So in Acts chapter 10, this takes place in the middle of a section of Acts where we have one unlikely convert after another. It starts with the Samaritans, and we know the Samaritans and the Jews were rivals of one another. They were part Jewish in a way, they had parts of the Old Testament, and that they were expecting the Messiah. And so it may be surprising, but maybe it's not so surprising that the gospel gets opened up to the Samaritans. And then we read about a guy named Simon who was a sorcerer, who practiced witchcraft, becomes a Christian. Oh wow, okay. Your past can be very sketchy, but you can still be accepted in. Okay, wonderful. But then it goes even further, and we actually read about this morning in Bible class, the Ethiopian eunuch. A Gentile, a proselyte, in other words, somebody who had converted to Judaism as much as he could. This is a man who had been kind of an outcast, separated from Judaism, but he tried as much as he could to serve the God of Israel, Yahweh. But here he is being opened up to the gospel. And then in chapter 9, a guy who's trying to murder Christians. A guy who's trying to destroy the church becomes a Christian and Saul. And his work becomes the great apostle Paul. So Paul, he was a Jewish, very devout Jewish person. He just needed to know who the Messiah was, and then he would accept the Messiah, and that's what he did. Whereas the barrier that's going to be torn down in chapter 10 is a barrier that has been done for generations. This barrier between Jew and Gentile. A Jewish person, when they looked at Gentile, they saw somebody who was unclean, somebody who was undesirable, somebody to stay away from. And this is the barrier that God is going to confront directly. So let's go ahead and read together. Acts chapter 10, of course, we read about this unlikely convert. His name is Cornelius. Let's read it starting verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was called the Italian regiment. So the first thing we find out about him is that he is a centurion. He's a Roman soldier. He's a pretty high-ranking, he's not a five-star general or anything like that, but he is high-ranking. He has servants, he has wealth, and he's stationed in Caesarea, which is essentially Rome Central, the capital of Judea in the Roman eyes. We think of Jerusalem as the capital of Judea, but that's just how the Jews thought of it. The Gentiles, the Romans, they thought of Caesarea, this city by the sea, as Rome's capital of Judea. And this is where he's stationed. So it's obvious that he is a prominent soldier. If you have to be stationed in Judea, this is where you want to be stationed, if you're Rome. But we find out a couple of interesting things about him in verse 2. He and all his household were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to the people and prayed to God regularly. So again, if you were in the Bible class this morning, we saw this with the Ethiopian, where we wonder, how is this guy who is a complete outsider, how does he come to the point where he believes in the God of Israel? And he's trying to devote his life to the God of Israel. Well, we don't know. We don't know how he got to this point. But we do know that there are always going to be seekers out there. People who are looking and searching for the true God. And they're going to come from the most unlikely places. And this is one of those cases. He's devout. He's giving money generously to the Jewish people. He is praying continually. Verse 3 says, one day about the ninth hour was about 3 p.m. This is one of the hours of prayer for the Jewish people at that time. So he's probably praying in this moment. It says, one day about the ninth hour, he had a clear vision of an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear and asked, what is it, Lord? The angel answered, your prayers and gifts of the poor have ascended as a memorial offering before God. Now send them to Joppa to call for a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea. And this is up about 35 miles north in Joppa. So an angel comes to him and says, you've been heard, now send for Simon Peter. Now we read that, and we might read past it, but I don't want us to. I want us to notice something. The angel tells them, okay, send out servants 35 miles north, that's going to take a day's journey. Grab Simon Peter, and then come bring him back. That's about 2 days. One day there, one day back. Why jump through hoops here? Why doesn't the angel just tell him the gospel right here and now? We might say, well, humans are the ones who have been tasked with spreading the gospel. We're the ones who receive it, we're the ones who spread it. Okay, why not bring in somebody who lives in town? We know there's Christians in Caesarea. In fact, in chapter 8, we found out that there's a man named Philip, who we know has no problem spreading the gospel to people who don't look like him. He's the one who spread the gospel to the Ethiopian eunuch. Well, we find out in chapter 8, he lives in Caesarea. So why not call for Philip, who lives right down the road, who's very used to spreading the gospel to outsiders? I think there's a very important reason. He's calling for Simon specifically, Peter specifically, because this whole story, this is not just a story about a Roman who becomes a Christian. This is a story about not only a non-like convert, but also a story of a hesitant preacher. And we need to see that. that show us he was hesitant to do this. So let's go ahead and look at verse 9. Cornelius sends men his way. The next day, at about the 6th hour, this is noon, as the men were approaching the city on their journey, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, but while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. This is more like a dream than perhaps Cornelius' vision. I think several of you have fallen into a trance by this point, so I'm going to ask you to wake up. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. And this is a wild vision he sees. Because this giant sheet, it contained all kinds of four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth, as well as birds of the air. And then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." So he's being shown all these animals, and he's hungry. It's lunchtime. But all of these animals are unclean. In other words, they went against the dietary restrictions of the Jewish people. And so what does Peter do? Faithful Peter says, "No, Lord." Peter answered, verse 14, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." You notice Peter's often in the habit of saying no to God. And he's always got what he thinks is a good reason. You know, when Jesus first came up to him and said, "Cast your nets out," Peter almost says no in that moment. He says, "Okay, because you said it, I will." And then he wanted to follow Jesus. Later on, Jesus tells them, "We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be crucified." And Peter says, "No, no, no, Lord. Don't you ever say that again." And Jesus has to rebuke him. Then there's another moment later when they're around the table together. And Jesus tells them they're all going to abandon him and betray him, essentially. And Peter says, "Not me, Lord, that's not going to happen to me." And then another moment in that same meal, Jesus is washing all their feet. Peter says, "No, you can't wash my feet." And at that point, Jesus says, "Don't let me wash your feet. You have no part of me. You have no part of me." Peter's often saying no to God, and here he does it again. He says, he thinks he has a good reason. He says, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." I'm trying to follow my proper Jewish dietary laws here. He thinks it's a test. But there's something very confusing to me. I'm very puzzled by Peter in this story. Do you guys catch where he's staying? He's saying, where is he staying? He's staying in a guy named Simon's house, who is a tanner. You guys know what that is? Somebody who works with animal skins. Somebody who works with dead animals, carcasses. Tanners, under the old law, were considered ceremonially unclean. They were not only outcast because of the pungent odor that surrounded their profession, they were also outcast because they were ceremonially unclean according to the Jewish law. So why is Peter staying there if he's so worried about cleanliness and purity? I don't know. I'm kind of confused by Peter here, I have to admit. It almost seems like he's picking and choosing what laws are important. And that idea is going to come back in a little bit. So Peter says no to the Lord. And by the way, I just want a quick note. When an angel, or the Holy Spirit in this case, speaks to each man, Cornelius' first response is to say, "What is it, Lord?" Peter's response is to say, "No, Lord." He calls him Master, he calls him Lord, and then he's saying no to him. That's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? But look what happens, verse 15. The voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." And this happened 3 times, and all at once the sheet was taken back up into heaven. It has to happen 3 times. I think there's a reason. Peter needs to get the message. He doesn't just hear it once, he hears it 3 times. And what does he hear? This very important statement in verse 15. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. God is not talking about food here. And Peter's going to understand that in just a little bit. Now, while Peter was puzzling over the meaning of this vision, verse 17, the men sent by Cornelius found Simon's house and approached the gate. They called out to ask if Simon, called Peter, was staying there. As Peter continued to reflect on the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are looking for you. So get up, go downstairs, and accompany them without hesitation. Because I said, your version might say, without doubting anything, or doubting nothing." And I think sometimes we read past that, but we shouldn't read past it, because this implies that there's a hesitation on Peter's part. He's going to go downstairs and he's going to see that they are Gentiles. And he's going to have hesitancy. He's going to be hesitant to go with them. But the Spirit says to him, don't hesitate. Don't, some versions even say, don't ask questions. Which, if that's the real rendering, it's very ironic, because the first thing Peter does is ask a question when he goes downstairs. Verse 21. So Peter went down to the men and said to them, "Here am I, the one you were looking for. Why have you come?" And they tell him all about Cornelius. And Peter invites them in as his guests. Which, hey, good for Peter. I've been hard on Peter so far. Good for him that he actually invites them in. This was not against the Jewish law, but it would have been frowned upon by a lot of the Jewish leaders at this time. So good for Peter. He's perhaps at this moment he's starting to put aside this barrier that he had grown up with. A barrier that had been with him since childhood. The way he looked at outsiders, the way he looked at Gentiles. God perhaps is not with him. And I think he has, especially when he's free. So he follows them down to Caesarea. When they arrive, verse 25, Cornelius falls down at his feet to worship him. Peter stands up and says, "Oh, man, just like you." Then verse 27, Peter talked with him, and he went inside and found many people gathered together. I love this about Cornelius. What does it do when God says, you're going to hear a message from God when Simon Peter gets here? Cornelius' first response is gather up all his friends and family. Let's fill the house. I love that about Cornelius here. He made sure that everybody has come together to hear it. So look at what Peter says. The first thing he says to this group, I wish Peter had a little bit more tact sometimes. Look what he says. "You know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with a foreigner or visit. But God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean." There it is. Peter has gotten the message. This isn't about food. It's about the way he's been looking at outsiders. The way he's been putting up barriers in his own heart toward the Roman world, toward the Gentile world. And God is about to not only tear that barrier down, but he's going to open the doors of the church wide open. His gospel is not just for the Jewish people. Let's read. Cornelius tells the whole story of how this happened. And then verse 34, we get to a great, succinct, beautiful telling of the gospel message. Then Peter began to speak. "I now truly understand that God does not show favoritism, but welcomes those from every nation who fear him and do what is right. He has sent this message to the people of Israel, proclaiming the gospel of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You yourselves know what has happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee with the baptism that John proclaimed, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, and how Jesus went around doing good and healing all those who were oppressed by the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of all that he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem. And although they put him to death by hanging him on a tree, God raised him up on the third day and caused him to be seen, not by all people, but by the witnesses God had chosen beforehand, by us, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to judge the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name." Beautiful, succinct. I bet you wish I could be so succinct. But here he is. He preaches the gospel. And he does, there are several, he's relying on Cornelius' understanding or remembrance of recent events. He knows Cornelius has at least heard about Jesus. So he's using that he also uses two pieces of evidence to prove who Jesus is. And these are the same two pieces of evidence that Peter always uses. Throughout Acts and even into the letters of Peter, 2 Peter especially, he deals with these two pieces of evidence. And these are such strong pieces of evidence that we didn't know them. Number one, eyewitness testimony. Because we saw it for ourselves. And that's what the Gospels are. When we read the Gospels, we're reading eyewitness testimony. And his second piece of evidence is the prophets. So this is everything that the prophets, wrote about ahead of time. It's all been pointing to Jesus. These are the two main pieces of evidence that Peter will always use when he's spreading the gospel. And they should be the main pieces of evidence we use also. Now, he teaches the gospel. What happens next? Well, this is where everything is turned upside down. This is where we get a heavenly sign that changes. Verse 44. While Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the message. All the circumcised believers who accompanied Peter were astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles. They're astounded. They did not expect anything like this. Now this is reminding them of how the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the apostles in the upper room in Acts chapter 2. This is the only other time that we read of something like that happening. And there's a reason for that. They hear them speaking in tongues, verse 46. And then Peter said, "Can anyone withhold the water to baptize these people?" That implies that there would have been some who would have tried to withhold it ahead of this moment. There's all these barriers that it's really hard for them to let go of these barriers that they've been holding on to since childhood. So it's almost, I believe the reason why God poured out His Spirit upon them in this very moment is they needed to see this for themselves in order for it to really sink in. They needed to see it for themselves before they could truly accept the gospel of this word. You don't have to become a Jew first. You don't have to become circumcised first. There's not all these other, points of entry that we have power over. No, it's just baptism, and that's it. So he ordered them that they be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, and they asked him to stay a few days. This is a wonderful moment. This is a turning point in the whole church. After this point, the gospel is going to start spreading, not only to the Jewish people, but to the whole world, just as Jesus said it would. It's wonderful for Peter that he gets to be the one who is there on the front lines of this, because it seems like he really needed to learn this lesson. But I'm sad to say that it seems like Peter would years later have a relapse. Sometimes we have to learn the same lesson more than once. Anybody raise your hand? You don't have to raise your hand. You ever had to learn the same lesson twice? Sadly, this is just how we are. If you think about it, God, He is patient with us. He is slowly taking us to a better place. He is patiently bringing us to better understanding, to a better point, a place of love and hope. And more and more, He's conforming us into the image of Christ. He is working slowly on us. But Satan is too. Satan is patient also, not out of love, but patient like a lion, waiting for his prey. And Satan is trying to tie us back into our old ways, into the old sins of our life. And throughout our Christian life, we're going to be a part of this tug and pull. And the question is, are we going to yield to the Spirit and allow Him to lead us into these greater places and greater realms of growth, or are we going to slip back into our old ways? And Peter seems to have slipped back, or he did slip back, we're told, in this regard. Galatians chapter 2, this is years later. Paul is writing to the Galatian church. And he's talking about Peter. We're going to read the name Cephas. This is still Peter. This is his Jewish name. His Hebrew name, I Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself for fear of those in the circumcision. The verb tense is used with draw back, began to draw back, is the idea that this was a slow process. He didn't, immediately draw back, but he slowly began to withhold himself. And why did he do it? I don't know. Fear of what? Fear of losing his persona, public persona, fear that they're going to look down on him, these men who came from James, these men of the circumcision group, fear of being ostracized by them. Whatever it is, it's not a valid fear. So Paul has to say that. Verse 13 says, then the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. What do we mean when we say they were being hypocrites? Well, they're preaching a gospel that they say is for all, and yet by their own actions, they're living as if that's not true. They're being hypocrites in that way. And Paul's response is dead on money. Look what he had to say to them, to Cephas, to Peter. He says, when I saw that they were not walking in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, if you, who are a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? He's pointing out kind of what I pointed out earlier, which is that Peter seems to be picking and choosing which laws of the Old Covenant are still relevant to this situation. He's picking and choosing which ones he needs to follow, and yet he's also expecting Gentiles to become Jews for the Christians. He's telling them they have to do something he's not even willing to do. It's hypocrisy.
Down. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Spread the tidings all around. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Bear the news to every land. Climb the steeps and cross the waves. Onward to our Lord's command. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Beyond the rolling tide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Help to sinners far and wide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing ye islands of the sea, echo back ye ocean caves. Earth shall keep her jubilee. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. In the mighty voice, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Let the nations now rejoice. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. And salvation full and free, highest hills and deepest caves, lifts a song of victory. Jesus saves, Jesus saves.